launch into everything. So welcome everybody to this virtual tour, our historic happy hour brought to you by Chicago Detours. I wanted to introduce myself and Chicago Detours a little bit, and I know we have a couple of, quite a few repeat customers this evening, but it's always worth saying hi to everyone again. So I'll start with myself. My name is Alex Bean, if that helps you remember any better. I'm a big history nerd. I got some of that out of my system getting my master's from the University of Chicago. It was actually just this past week. It was a decade ago I got my degree. And I've been teaching at the city colleges of Chicago ever since then. Work as a tour guide and writer for Chicago Detours. And Chicago Detours typically offer in walking tours, driving tours, fun stuff like that. In the midst of the ongoing, health crisis that we've been doing here, we have switched to virtual tours and historic happy hours, as we call them, on weekdays like this one. And we're actually just today with this, we are launching a sort of new themed series in our historic happy hours. Thursday nights from now until basically the end of the summer, we're calling this our Chicago Architecture Crash Course. The idea is we are going to kind of launch into an introduction tonight. If I was in class, I would call this the syllabus distribution day. Then we are going to look at what we're going to be talking about for the next 12 weeks here. The idea is that we will try to go all the way back as far as we can in the architectural history of Chicago and talk about the major moments, the major styles, the big ideas, the influential names. And of course, that'll include a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of very famous figures, but we're gonna try and go beyond the loop, beyond the downtown skyline, where and when we can take a look at neighborhood architecture, at residences, and take a look at some of the big trends in architecture, including housing, including all sorts of different topics that tie into the built environment of Chicago. We're very excited for it. This is something that, we've kind of circled around to some degree in the past, but is definitely something that we're excited to be bringing to all of you this evening. So let's go ahead, jump into that. I am going to launch share screen. So you should be seeing in just a second here. Should be seeing my presentation. There it is. Let me open that right up. And if you're not seeing that, please do let me know. I always want to know if there's any sort of calamity going on with share screen. And then I'll have the group chat open on the side as well. So if you have any comments or any questions, feel free to pop into there and fire away. I will do my best to keep an eye on that and make sure that I am answering everything for you properly. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive in. Like I was saying, the concept behind this is that we want to get a sense of the depth, the breadth of Chicago's architecture. And this is, and that's actually me in the photograph here that was taken last summer. Yeah, it's okay if you take screenshots, that's fine. What we really want to do here is try to get as comprehensive as we can in 30-minute sessions, a sense of different time periods, different styles, different forms of construction and aesthetics and engineering, so that we can, when we're walking around Chicago, be able to look around the city, look at different buildings, and get a strong sense of when that building is constructed, why it was built that way, and how it maybe reflects the philosophies, the technologies of the times that it was coming from, because I think that really provides us a great and deeper appreciation for the beautiful built environment of this city. And I did want to mention Chicago, of course, is famous for its architecture. And over the course of our 12 weeks, I think it'll be pretty clear why we're so famous for our architecture. But there's a quotation that I think summarized it really well, and I regret to say that I can't remember whose quotation this was exactly, but they said that, of course, in an industrial city like Chicago, a workers' city like Chicago, the city of the big shoulders, our greatest contribution to the arts and culture of the world is that most practical form of art and ideas, architecture, buildings, places of habitation and work. We certainly have had our poets, our writers, our dreamers, and our artists, but our architects, I think, define us in the way that maybe the painters define France or the composers define Vienna. And I think that is something that is worth appreciating. It's worth getting to know those big names. It's worth getting to know their work, because that will definitely make us perhaps fully aware of just how special a place it is. All right, so let's take a look just really broadly here at the sweep of Chicago's architecture. Each of these is going to be a different installment. Next Thursday, for example, actually, before I move past this, I was just about to jump past this, but I almost forgot. The reason I chose this photograph here for the sort of intro page here is because this spot right here, I think, is actually a really fascinating place where we can see so many layers of Chicago's history, and especially its architectural history, piled right on top of each other. This is right at the Michigan Avenue Bridge, where the Magnificent Mile begins. And you would never know it today, but this is the oldest spot in Chicago, the area just to the left of the bridge where I'm kind of circling my cursor there. That's where Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable built a log cabin back 1790s or so, we think, where the Apple Store is standing on the Mag Mile today. That was the log cabin of an Afro-Caribbean French-Canadian fur trapper back in the Revolutionary era. Right across the river is where Fort Dearborn was built, and we'll talk about that next week as well. All of those structures are long gone, but you can still, if you know where to look for them, maybe find markers of that age. And then standing right here, you can see so many different ages and styles of Chicago's architecture. Just at a glance, I can see Beaux-Arts, I can see Art Deco, I can see modernism, I can see postmodernism, maybe brutalism, contemporary architecture, revival styles of architecture, brand new architecture is going to be built on this spot in just the next couple of years. That intersection, Michigan and Wacker, where the city was born, for whatever reason, people are drawn to that spot, and I think we'll find ourselves returning there off and on over the next 12 weeks to see how the next generation, the next phase in Chicago's architectural history pops up right here at the heart of the city itself. All right. So that being said, let's go ahead and talk about those major moments. I was saying next week we're going to be talking about Chicago's earliest buildings, from wigwams to taverns. And this is an era of Chicago that there is basically nothing left of. And I think that's actually what makes it sort of exciting for me. It's a time period that I have a deep fascination of, because this is not an old city, right? Chicago's earliest settlers that are not Native Americans are arriving in 1790. Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable is usually regarded as the founder of Chicago today because of the log cabin he builds over here, the estate or mansion, as it was called at the time. And across the river, Fort Dearborn, the other trading posts, taverns. This is a small community. It does not get big until the 1830s, 1840s. Once it does start getting big, it grows like crazy. And we're going to talk about that towards the tail end of next week, how this became one of the major metropoles of the new United States, this young country, within just a couple of decades of its settlement first really building up. But all of this, of course, disappears in the blink of an eye in 1871. And that's what makes it kind of fascinating to me. There are a couple of buildings outside of downtown that are still survivors from this time, the earliest days of Chicago, and I'll try to highlight a couple of those. But in downtown, the heart of the city, there's no trace of this time period. These are all ghosts. And I think that's actually really fascinating. We're not, like I said, we're not an old city, and yet we've got this lost city lingering right behind us. I always love that sort of thing. And I also think we can start to see some ideas, some modes of construction that might get carried forward into the Chicago that is all around us today, even if this city is, of course, destroyed. And it is destroyed, as I'm sure you know. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 levels the city center, and much of the north side, much of the built-up environment of the city is destroyed in 3 days, 2 nights in October of 1871. It's going to be really interesting to see how the city celebrates the 150th anniversary of that coming up in about a year and a half. But that destroys that first city of Chicago, and I did actually want to share this. I feel like I'm giving away one of my great insights, but if you've ever heard Chicago called the second city, it's not because we're second place to New York. We've dealt with it psychologically at this point. But we're called the first city of Chicago because, the second city, because that first city burns down in the fire in 1871. The city that's rebuilt afterwards is the second city built on those ashes. Now, of course, there's been a lot of construction and redevelopment since then, but the second city nickname doesn't mean we're second place, just means we burnt to the ground. Just so you know. But we'll talk about the Great Chicago Fire. We'll talk about how the city rebuilds after that cataclysm and how it rebuilds in such a way to guarantee that something like that can't happen again. And we'll talk about Gilded Age architecture. Gilded Age is the term for this time period at the end of the 1800s where the leaders of industry, the robber barons as they were called, built castles for themselves, built monuments to themselves, made themselves princes of capitalism here in Chicago. And we'll talk about some of those spectacular places, and we'll also talk about some of the commercial structures that are built in that time that you can still find examples of standing around the city. I am curious, does anyone know what the image on the right here is? The image on the left is, of course, the Great Chicago Fire. Does anyone know what our mansion on the right-hand side of the image is? No guesses? That, sad to say, is no longer with us. That is Potter Palmer's castle. This was the Palmer Castle, there you go, built on North Lakeshore Drive, long gone at this point. It was torn down decades and decades ago for an apartment block. But this caused the big shift from the south side to the north side of the Gilded Age elite. They went from Prairie Avenue to what's now the Gold Coast. So we'll talk about the Palmer Castle. We'll talk about Prairie Avenue, all of that sort of stuff coming at us in 2 weeks. And Sandy, yes, I'm happy to let you know about this origin of the name Second City. Now, of course, at the same time that all of this is happening, the fire and then the Gilded Age construction, we also see a brand new form of architecture born in Chicago. The world's first skyscraper is the Home Insurance Building, which is in the photograph that you see on the left right there, that's constructed back in 1885. It was a revolution in architectural history, rising higher on less material with more interior space available for office workers, in this case, than any other comparable building in history. This is the birth of every skyscraper that is standing in the world today. Sadly, again, this is demolished, but it does set off a huge burst of skyscraper construction in Chicago at the end of the 1800s. The images that you see in our other slides here are the Monadnock Building, a fascinating time capsule of this time period, really split right down the middle for ways I'll explain in a couple of weeks here. And on the right is the old Masonic Temple Tower, which has also been demolished. A lot of this stuff did get demolished, which is, again, kind of why I'm fascinated by it, these ghosts of Chicago's past. But we'll talk about this style of architecture. We'll talk about how they engineered this new form of construction and how they tried to apply more traditional forms of architectural design and aesthetics onto a brand new form of construction. Buildings that could be used haven't been this tall before. If a building was this tall, it was usually a monument that was just there to look at, like the pyramids or the Washington Monument. An occupiable building that stands hundreds of feet tall, that is brand new, and that is something that architects had to wrap their heads around. The Chicago School had a very particular approach to it. Later architects will have their own approach to it as well, but the Chicago School definitely lays down the groundwork for the rest of our architectural skyscraper history, at least. Now, at the same time as the first skyscrapers, we also want to talk about how the city is rebuilding and how it's trying to rebuild itself into a grand metropolis. We're going to spend a week talking about urban planning in Chicago. Our subtitle here is From the White City to Wacker Drive. We like that W to W alliteration there. But the great event there, the White City of the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, is not just a one-off event of the World's Fair. It provides a template, a blueprint for what cities could look like. That is something that Daniel Burnham tries to execute with his Burnham Plan of 1909. That's the image you see in the center here. This was supposed to be the new Civic Center, which is now where the Jane Burns Circle Interchange is, just outside of the Loop. This looks a little more pleasant than the interchange. This never gets built, but it has a deep and lasting influence on the lakefront and Wacker Drive in many neighborhoods, in civic architecture, worldwide influence of the White City and of what's called Beaux-Arts design. In many ways, this is an influence coming from Paris. Daniel Burnham had been trained in Paris, wanted this to be the Paris of the prairies. So you can see this influence in Chicago. It doesn't get built up quite the way Burnham wanted to, but it still has a lasting influence. It's worth talking about that because we can still find tangible hints of this located around the city. All right. Now, at the same time as Daniel Burnham is trying to make the city look like Paris, Frank Lloyd Wright is trying to make it look like something brand new. We will talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, his philosophies, and the broader Prairie School of architecture, which is, I would say, arguably the first form of modernist architecture to arrive in Chicago, and is probably the one that originates in Chicago more than any others. Frank Lloyd Wright here, of course, a native of Wisconsin, but he did a lot of his great early work in Chicago, and you can still find many of his landmarks. In fact, what you see right here, the Roby House, which is right across the street from the University of Chicago's campus, this just last year became a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the global influence of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie School of Architecture, along with a couple of other Wright structures around the state of Illinois. This is actually the only UNESCO World Heritage Site in the city of Chicago, which makes it very unique and makes it something that is definitely worth delving into, especially because in many ways, the architecture we're seeing right here is decades ahead of its time and has a lasting influence, especially after World War II. I am curious here, if anyone's unfamiliar with the Roby House, if you know its backstory, don't guess, but if you're unfamiliar with the Roby House, when would you say this building was constructed? Just curious if you put your answer into chat here. Any guesses? 1920? Any other guesses? 25. All right, we're more accurate than a lot of my 1950s. That's actually, Janet there, that guess is what I typically get. Yeah, 1950s. A lot of people see this and they think post-World War suburban housing. This is built about 1910, earlier than any of our guesses. And don't feel bad if you got it wrong. That just tells you how far ahead of the curve Wright was and how big an influence the Prairie School has, especially on residential architecture, as we'll talk about later on. All right. Now, I also want to talk about glamorous architecture. The Art Deco age in Chicago, in my opinion, is a little too brief. It really only lasts maybe 10 years or so, from the mid-20s until the mid-30s. But if you made me pick one style of architecture that I'm more drawn to than any other, it might be Art Deco architecture. I literally created an Art Deco day for myself a couple of months ago, where I just wandered around downtown taking photographs of just this one style of architecture. So we're going to talk about this grand style. This is the old post office building here in downtown Chicago. We'll talk about the famous skyscrapers like the Board of Trade, the Carbide and Carbon building, and we'll talk about how you can find little Art Deco influences beyond just big grand buildings, but in a whole lot of different design elements, including in a lot of the industry that was building up in Chicago, reaching its zenith in Chicago in this age in the early 20th century. Now, we'll talk about, after the World War II, we'll talk about modernism and Mies van der Rohe, a little bit of a love it or hate it style here. Mies van der Rohe, transplant from Germany, who brings his glass and steel grids from the Bauhaus school, transplants them onto the prairies of Chicago. And he said he was just following what Chicagoans had done before. His mantra of less is more, he said, was just a continuation of the great Chicago architect Louis Sullivan's adage that form follows function. We'll investigate those ideas. What did Sullivan mean by form follows function? What did Mies mean by less is more? And we'll also talk about the reaction many people have to Mies van der Rohe and the modernist school of architecture. This is his Federal Plaza in downtown Chicago. And this is a plaza I've taken many people to, and very often the reaction people have is that this is an overwhelming style of architecture. It feels cold, institutional, inhumane. I certainly get that experience. I think a lot of modernism can create that effect in us. There is a very human, maybe even humane element in Mies's design, a harmony to it that I think is worth exploring. And we'll look at both Mies's work and some of his successors, especially the great architects at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, who create the landmark super talls like the Hancock Center and the Sears Tower. Now, we also want to talk about not just the upsides, but some of the downsides of Chicago's architectural history. The same time that Mies van der Rohe is arriving in Chicago and putting his imprint on the city is the same time that a lot of that second city that's built in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s starts to get destroyed. This is an era that eventually gets known as the urban crisis, the crisis of the cities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in Chicago, it has a couple of really profound impacts on how people lived, where people lived, what their life was like. It also ripped huge gashes right through the city itself. The freeways, especially in my opinion, are something that really breaks up the flow of the human scale of the city. And it also meant we lost much of our historical architectural heritage. Building something on the left, like the Robert Taylor homes or the Lake Meadows apartment complexes in Bronzeville on the south side, meant that the old Stroll, the jazz district in Bronzeville, was demolished, along with building things like IIT. And so that's something that's worth talking about, redevelopment and demolition and the wreckage that can sometimes leave in its wake. And we'll talk about historic preservation as well. The image you see on the right is the demolition of the Garrick Theater, an absolutely incredible design by Louis Sullivan that was torn down in the 1960s and replaced with a bus station that lasted all of 20 years. So we'll talk about the loss of things like the Garrick Theater, the Chicago Stock Exchange, many other early classics of Chicago architecture, and how we eventually, actually through the loss of life, get to a historic preservation movement in Chicago that gets to landmarking, that saves many of those grand old buildings for us. Now, we'll also talk about the type of construction that comes along after the death of Mies van der Rohe, the brutalist architecture that is perhaps best typified by the University of Illinois at Chicago's campus. This is in the middle of campus at UIC, just outside of the Loop. When I walked through the UIC campus, I'll admit, I thought to myself, this is either absolutely brilliant or this campus is a very elaborate practical joke that seems a little too cruel. That's sort of my reaction to Brutalist in some ways, but this is a style that has its defenders. It's worth talking about and exploring a little bit. The ugly, I think, pretty common reaction to it. We'll talk about why people thought this was maybe the architecture of the future. We'll talk about the style of postmodernism as well, which comes along in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and is a really eclectic style that doesn't necessarily hew to just one material like Brutalism does with concrete, doesn't hew to just one aesthetic like modernism did with Mies van der Rohe, but instead kind of hops all over the place and provides a really interesting cleansing of the palette almost after some very uniform styles from Art Deco to modernism to Brutalism. So we'll tackle that. We'll talk about residential architecture. We won't get a chance, just for time constraints, to talk about all types of vernacular architecture. Vernacular is a term that can mean any form of architecture out in the neighborhoods, anything from shops to gas stations to factories. Factories might not be vernacular, you kind of get the idea. But we want to focus specifically on homes, the places people live in Chicago. We're going to try and tackle as many different types of homes as you can find in Chicago, at least the ones that are still standing, going all the way back to the workers' cottages that are built back in the 1860s, 1870s, many of which are still standing, to the McMansions, as I love calling them, that are being built often on the same block, directly next door to the workers' cottages. Believe it or not, the image that you see on the right, that is a single family home in the Lincoln Park neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. It's in a dense urban neighborhood, and it looks like a country estate. Just a couple of years old here as well. I think that one is maybe 15 years old at this point. So we'll talk about how, we can get from workers' cottages to mansions. We'll talk about courtyard apartments. We'll talk about two flats. We'll talk about all sorts of good stuff. I'm really looking forward to talking about the homes of Chicago. And then we'll wrap things up. This will be the last installment of the semester, talking about computers, the influence they have on architecture and on contemporary design. Most skyscrapers that are being built today, most homes that are being built today, rely on what's called computer-aided architectural design. And in many cases, that allows for feats of engineering that would have been incomprehensible even a couple of decades ago. My favorite example of that is the photograph that the building you see in the photograph right here, 150 North Riverside, which is the skyscraper on a cantilevered foundation. If you look at it here, you can see the base of the building is only about 1/3 the width of the tower that rises up above it. It gets so dramatically narrow as it reaches the bottom because it only had a sliver of land in between railroad tracks and the river to build on top of, but they wanted to maximize the space. So they used computer engineering to just tilt this thing right on top of its foundation with the L rumbling right past it. This is something that somebody might have dreamed this design decades ago. Without the aid of computer engineering, it would have been impossible to actually execute. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how that's allowing skyscrapers to achieve different shapes, new heights, new designs, and we'll talk about the future here as well. There is a bevy of new skyscrapers that are under construction that are being approved literally in the past couple of weeks here that are going to redefine the skyline. So we definitely want to get wrap our head around the past decade or so, maybe the past 15 years of Chicago architecture, maybe try and get a sense of what the next 15 years of architecture might look like as well. Paul saying he was always waiting to see a disaster. Yes, this is definitely a building that has made people a little green in the gills in my experience. I've led boat tours that go right underneath this building, and I always jokingly say, can't you just imagine a day where there's a really strong wind? This is the Windy City after all, and it just comes along and knocks that thing over sideways because it's built on such a narrow foundation. And you can see a bunch of people on the boat start to look very worried. It's not a realistic thing, but I do love sharing that. All right, so that gives you a sense the scope of Chicago architecture. I wanted to say thank you, of course, for joining us this evening, for passing out the syllabus, as I was saying right here. We really appreciate your support for helping us do these things. We want to be able to keep bringing you free public virtual tours like this one. So support $5 donation to a $25 donation, even a few dollars. I know it is tough times, but as a small business that hasn't been able to rely on its traditional revenue for months now, we are very grateful for any support that we might be able to get. So you can see our information right here. No homework. I thought about assigning homework. I really honestly did. No homework. This is going to be one of those easy classes where you can just mail it in, right? I also wanted to mention a little bit as well, because we are pretty excited about what we're doing right here. Oh, I jumped to the wrong one. Sorry, give me a second here. We are pretty excited about what we're doing here. So I wanted to show you a couple of my other tabs in order to give you a sense of what you might be able to do with this. We're actually going to only make the live stream of this on Facebook available for a brief window. It's not going to be uploaded onto YouTube. We think this is a pretty special thing that we put together here. So we're actually going to make this something that you'll be able to purchase and have access to as a 12-week series. I'll paste the link for this into the group chat if anybody is interested in this. But this is something that we're excited about. We think this is something that you might want to have access to in the future. So pasted that link in right here so you can see this in the future if you care to. I also wanted to mention we do have our YouTube channel up and running. We've got upcoming virtual tours. Let me keep going in my presentation here really quickly. I'll scroll through my tabs really quick. Sorry, there you go. Our Chicago Detours Tour Company, you can see right there. I'll paste this link in. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a great way to catch up on past tours. You can see our most recent ones here: Trailblazing Chicago Inventors, Hidden Architecture of Ravenswood, a virtual tour of Bridgeport. We got all sorts of fun stuff. And they're only available on YouTube for a limited time. So make sure you subscribe. You'll get those notifications when that happens. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, of course, we'll be doing these historic happy hours and virtual tours. We got a lot of fun stuff. And we're like I was saying, we really are trying to theme these different days of the week. So Thursday is going to be this architecture crash course. I'm also excited for Paul asked about Ukrainian Village. I'm definitely going to hit Ukrainian Village when we talk about the residential architecture. That week especially, we're going to look at. And I think I'll also talk about the hospital that's over there. I can't remember the exact name of it off the top of my head, but it's a really interesting example of brutalism. So Ukrainian Village will definitely get a little bit of love and attention from us at Chicago Detours. And what was the last thing I was going to... Oh, I also want to mention as well, we got another series that I'm going to be hosting a lot of episodes of that I'm pretty excited about. We're calling it Conversations with Chicagoans, or Monday Chats. The idea is that on Mondays, we have lined up a couple of guests who do really interesting work that intersects with Chicago's history, with its architecture, with its culture. We're going to let them introduce themselves, talk about their work, maybe show some examples, those sorts of things. I'll have some questions for them, and then we'd love to be able to get questions from the audience. On Monday, I wanted to mention, let me pull it up right here. We are going to have a guy named Phil, who's the lead artist for Cape Horn Illustration, who does these incredible pen and ink drawings of Chicago buildings, does paintings. We're really excited to talk to him, to learn about his work, his approach to things, and how he got into this and how he is so good at creating these drawings. And I did want to mention, don't want to make it feel like you have to come along, but I do definitely recommend coming along because he's got a discount code that we'll be able to share with folks who tune in to Monday's Historic Happy Hour and our first conversation with Chicagoans. So I know I've been kind of hyping us up a little bit here. Thank you all for joining me. I did want to ask, yeah, happy to have everybody. It looks like we've got people who are very much into what we're doing here. I'm very excited to see that. I did want to ask really quickly, any questions about what we're up to? I know we had the question about Ukrainian Village. Definitely happy to see that. Please do let me know if you've got any other questions as we finish up here. And we always like asking too, if there's anything from what we talked about that people thought was particularly interesting. Logan Square, yeah, Logan Square will definitely come up. That'll come up actually during the urban planning talk as well as during the residential architecture. I know a couple of people learned about the origins of the name Second City there. Always love having little moments like that. Giving out new information is one of my favorite things. Printers Row, yeah, Printers Row should definitely come up, especially when we're talking about the early days of the skyscraper. That is definitely something that there's influential buildings down there. Back of the Yards, I will definitely make sure when we're talking about residential architecture, talk about back of the yards, and I'm sure it'll come up when we talk about Chicago's industry as well. And we have Logan Square Bars next Friday. It's Amanda there, logged in as Chicago Detours as well. All right, I think that Hyde Park will absolutely come up. There would never be, it would be impossible for me to talk about Chicago architecture without Hyde Park. It was actually the first neighborhood I lived in Chicago. I will always sort of consider that my home base in many ways. All right, thank you so much. Where They Shot Shameless is probably a whole different series of talks in all honesty. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think that's just about all the time that we have for this evening. Thanks so much for coming along. I hope you had a good intro, good passing out of the syllabus this evening. Stopping the screen share, saying good night to everybody. Looking forward to seeing you back here on Thursdays in the future. And yeah, I hope everybody has a really fantastic evening. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all the support you have provided for us as well. And cheers, everyone.